Experience the world's #1 AI answer engine for the Catholic Church. Every answer is supported by citations from a vast library of over 18,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts. Trusted in over 165 countries and 50 languages, Magisterium AI is your partner for faithful, accurate insights. Start your journey for free at magisterium.com.
Hi, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we look back over the last 7 days on the Vatican and the global church beat. We start this week with not partying quite yet. Of course, over the last several days, we, along with the whole world, have been watching those images of massive jubilation in Syria at the fall of the 53-year-old Assad regime. Yet there is one constituency in the country not quite ready yet to join the party, and that is Syria's small but enormously significant Christian minority. We'll explain why and what the future might hold. Second up, this week, we've got a pickle in Peru. How a criminal complaint against a Vatican official currently before Peruvian courts raises issues from diplomatic immunity and Vatican sovereignty to religious freedom and the Vatican's capacity to fight sex abuse. We will unpack all of that and explain where things might go from here. Third up, this week, we've got Go Irish. No, wait, that's actually the wrong Notre Dame. The Notre Dame that is in the news this week is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which staged its massive reopening gala this weekend after the fire that nearly destroyed the cathedral 5 years ago. One personality was conspicuous by his absence. We'll explain what to make of Pope Francis not being there, and perhaps just as importantly, what not to make. Finally, this week, we've got the politics of Christmas, how a nativity set in the Vatican's audience hall that features the baby Jesus laying on a recognizable symbol of Palestinian resistance has predictably raised objections from the Israeli side, and also once again raised questions about the Vatican's attempt to navigate the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian problem. All that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church, so please don't go anywhere. I'm not going to leave. You shouldn't either. I'll be right back. All right, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, December 10th in 2024. It is cold here in Rome, at least by Roman standards. I'm not talking Ulaanbaatar cold, which is where I was last Christmas. Nevertheless, wherever you are right now, I hope you are safe, warm, and happy. We begin this week by looking at developments in Syria. Of course, most of us woke up Sunday morning over the last weekend stunned at the news that the seemingly intractable 53-year-old Assad regime in Syria, launched by Hafez al-Assad and then continued by his son Bashar, which, as I say, as of a week ago, seemed like it was good to go for some time yet to come, nevertheless crumbled after a lightning-fast rebel offensive that swept across the country and ended up in Damascus, where it took control of the instruments of government. And in consequence, we have seen these scenes of just absolute ecstasy and rejoicing playing out in the streets of all of Syria's major cities. And of course, all of that is enormously understandable because the Assad regime, by pretty much any calculus one chooses to employ, was one of the most brutal and cruelest authoritarian regimes on the face of the earth. I mean, we're talking about a regime that used chemical weapons against its own people. We're talking about a regime that would throw people into jail, dissidents, political prisoners, and so on, and leave them there to rot for decades, that used force for almost any imaginable reason, that suppressed resistance, that marginalized and persecuted criticism, and just in pretty much every way you could imagine, profiled as the antithesis of a legitimate representative government based upon the will of the people. So, understandable why people are celebrating. Nevertheless, there are a few minority communities in Syria that are not quite yet ready to join the kind of dancing on the streets that most Syrians are engaging in these days. I mean, obviously, there is the minority Alawite community. That's the minority Muslim group that the Assad family came from. Of course, the majority of Syrians, like the majority of Muslims around the world, are Sunnis. Understandably, they have fears about retribution. But another minority community in Syria that has its own concerns these days would be Syria's small but important Christian community. Prior to the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, it was believed that there were about 1.5 million Christians in Syria. That was enough for about 10% of the national population. And of course, it's a spiritually and historically highly significant community. Its roots reach all the way back to the apostolic era. I mean, in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, on the conversions that are described on Pentecost, when the tongues of fire descended upon the multitudes. There were individuals from Syria there who, according to the tradition, went back and spread the faith in that country. So we're talking about an extremely ancient church. Now, the impact of more than 10 years of civil war had already devastated that community. Today, the estimate is there may be about 300,000 Christians left. Now, many of them fled the country for the same reasons that millions of other Syrians did, that is, economic stagnation, violence and chaos of war, and so on. But some of them also left because there have been periodic outbreaks of Islamic radicalism, jihadism, that has specifically targeted Christian communities. Now, the leaders of the resistance who have seized power in Syria have, up to this point, said all the right things. They have emphasized that they want to respect the pluralistic history of Syria, its traditional profile as a meeting place of cultures. They want to provide religious tolerance and room for minority communities. This, despite the fact that one of the important components of the Syrian opposition movement is a former Al Qaeda and ISIS linked group of Islamic militants. Nevertheless, they have insisted that they too want to provide peace and security for all of Syria's people. And so the rhetoric is reassuring, but Syria's Christians are waiting to see the reality. Obviously, the fear here is that Syria could go the way of Iraq, another Middle Eastern state where a long-standing dictator fell, and what ensued was chaos and instability and the rise of radical Islamic movements that spelled real trouble for Iraq's embattled Christian community. Obviously, Syrian Christians are concerned that something of the same thing could happen to them. So, one positive note here is that the resistance is unlikely to turn to, say, for example, Iran, because Iran, of course, was one of the major backers of Assad. They might be more open to dialogue and support from the West because the West was the major opponent of the Assad regime, which might give Western governments, perhaps especially France, because Syria was once a French mandate, it might give the Western powers a bit of leverage in trying to influence whoever now comes to power in Syria to live up to those promises to protect the minority groups. As ever, we will see, and we'll track the evolving story on Crux. Second up this week, we've got that pickle in Peru. So A couple of years ago, the Pope sent his top two investigators on sex abuse cases, Maltese Archbishop Charles Scicluna, Spanish Monsignor Jordi Bertomeu, to Peru to launch an inquest into the sodality of Christian life. This is a movement founded in 1971 by Peruvian layman Luis Fernando Figari. As a result of that investigation, Figari has been expelled from the community. 14 other individuals have been expelled from the community. And, we'll see what else might come out of it. But along the way, while Scicluna and Bertomeu were in Peru collecting testimony, Bertomeu had a conversation with a couple of individuals who subsequently have filed a criminal complaint against him in a court in Peru, alleging that he leaked their identities and the contents, their testimonies to the press, and that compromised their privacy, violated their secrecy, or violated the appropriate secrecy of the process. Now, without at all trying to adjudicate the rights and wrongs of those claims, it is worth saying that the idea of a criminal prosecution of a Vatican official, a Vatican representative, in a foreign court raises all kinds of issues before we even get to what actually may have happened, okay? Issue number one, of course, is diplomatic immunity, ancient pillar of foreign relations, enshrined or codified by the Vienna Conventions on diplomatic relations and consular relations in the 19th century. Granted, Bertomeu in this instance was not the papal ambassador to Peru, nor was he a member of the embassy staff, but he still, under legal theory and international law, would enjoy what is known as conduct-based immunity, which means it doesn't attach to his person, but to what he was doing. And the idea is if that he was an official of a foreign government carrying out an activity sanctioned by that government, as long as it doesn't fall into a recognized exception, which are things like committing assassinations or kidnappings or spying, as long as he wasn't doing those things, then he should still enjoy broad immunity from arrest or prosecution. So if this case is allowed to go forward, it raises questions about the whole concept of diplomatic immunity as a pillar of international relations. Second, it raises issues about the Vatican's sovereign status. If a foreign government begins chipping away at it, then the concern would be, will it be able to hold over the long run? Third, this case raises obvious religious freedom concerns. Should a civil government really be telling a church how to conduct its own internal investigations? I mean, isn't that something that a religious body ought to be able to determine for itself? Unless it is, obviously and crassly putting life and limb at risk or something like that, then one would think that the concept of religious freedom ought to provide them insulation from review and control by the state. Fourth, this raises questions about the Vatican's willingness to launch similar investigations in the future. That is, if there is a concern that a government might prosecute the officials engaged in these investigations, then the Vatican might be more reluctant to launch them. That could impede its capacity to impose discipline and to get to the bottom of sex abuse allegations all around the world. And then fifth and finally, it also raises questions about even if the Vatican were to continue to launch such investigations, which priests would agree to do it, knowing that there is a possibility that they might have to go to jail for the way they conduct these investigations. So for all kinds of reasons, which have nothing really to do with the direct rights and wrongs of the case, this is a prosecution that is deeply problematic. One would expect that Peru's new cardinal, Cardinal Castellón, who just got his red hat this Saturday here in Rome, will undoubtedly want to address this situation once he gets back to Lima. All right, third up, this week. As mentioned, we have the gala celebration over the weekend of the reopening of the Cathedral of Notre Dame after that horrific fire. And it has to be said, major kudos to the French, both state and church, for being able to get the cathedral back up and running in such a remarkably short period of time. It's a demonstration of the ancient adage, where there is a will, there is a way. And of course, lots of VIPs showed up for the opening liturgy. President-elect Donald Trump of the United States was there, accompanied by his buddy Elon Musk, even though he showed up a bit late. President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine was in attendance. From here in Italy, both President Sergio Mattarella and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni were there, and on and on. So there were a number of important political and social personalities. However, there was one conspicuous by his absence, and that, of course, was Pope Francis. Now, let's be clear, the Pope never said that he was going to go to the ceremony marking the reopening. Nevertheless, there were a number of media outlets, particularly French, who were speculating that the Pope's decision not to show up was somehow a snub. A snub, perhaps A, to France, B, to Paris, C, to Emmanuel Macron, or maybe all of the above. Now, the papal nuncio in France, Italian Archbishop Celestino Migliore, insisted that this is not the case. He cited two reasons as to why Pope Francis chose not to go. One, he said, the Pope simply prefers the peripheries of the world. If he's going to travel, he prefers to do so to reach out to people who have traditionally been forgotten, marginalized, oppressed. And number two, and he said this was the real reason, the Pope understood that if he showed up, he would have become the star of the show. That is, he would have been something of a distraction. And in a spirit of synodality, Migliore said, the Pope wanted the focus to be on the local church and its shepherd, Archbishop Laurent Ulrich of the Archdiocese of Paris. Now, two other explanations that Migliore could have given that he didn't. One, we should note, it's not like the Pope has never been to France. He's already been to France twice. He went to Strasbourg and he went to Marseille. Strasbourg to visit the European institutions, Marseille for a conference on the Mediterranean. And he's going to be in Corsica next week, December 15th. And so, to style this as a snub to France really doesn't pass muster. He hasn't been to Paris, that's true. But in general, we all know, Pope Francis really does not like the pomp and circumstance of state visits. If he can avoid them, he does. It's sort of as simple as that. And then one other point, not of, minor import, is that it wasn't like he was just sitting around at the house on Saturday, watching reruns of, the Housewives of Orange County or something like that. He actually had a consistory here in Rome in which he distributed red hats to 20 new cardinals. And then the next day, this past Sunday, he celebrated Mass with those cardinals. Now, admittedly, that was a papal event. He could have chosen a different time for it if he'd wanted, I suppose. But the point simply is that we really shouldn't overinterpret this. I don't think one can draw the conclusion that somehow the Pope doesn't care that Notre Dame is back up and running or that he just hates the French. I think it's probably more likely that he doesn't like pomp and circumstance, and further, that he knew in the back of his mind he was going to France in a week anyway. And I think that probably is more or less the whole story. Obviously, of course, we will have coverage of the Corsica trip when it occurs. And then, last but not least, this week, we have the politics of Christmas. So also on Saturday, in addition to that consistory, The Pope had an audience in the morning. It was actually an audience with the people from one of the regions of Italy who had presented the Vatican's Christmas tree and that massive nativity set out front of St. Peter's Basilica this year. And it was sort of, a thank you meet and greet for this group. But in addition, during that audience, the Pope also met a group from the Palestinian embassy to the Holy See who had brought the Pope a smaller nativity set to display in the Pope's audience hall. That is the Aula, what the Italians call the Aula Nervi, named after Paolo Nervi, who is the architect who designed it in the 1970s. And this small nativity set featured the baby Jesus in the crib resting upon a keffiyeh. Now, the keffiyeh is that black and white checked scarf that is the internationally recognized symbol of Palestinian resistance. You probably remember, this is what Yasser Arafat wore, and it is just known the world round as what you put on if you want to demonstrate solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And so, the fact that we have a keffiyeh cradling the baby Jesus in the nativity set in the Pope's audience hall obviously caught eyes and, set tongues wagging in many corners of the world. Because the question that obviously arises is this a political statement on behalf of the Pope? Now, the Palestinian embassy was very quick to put out a statement indicating that although the keffiyeh is indeed a symbol of Palestinian political and at times armed resistance to the Israeli occupation, what they term the Israeli occupation, nevertheless, they said that the Pope didn't necessarily look at it that way. He simply looked at it as a way to be in solidarity with all those children around the world this Christmas who are dealing with war, who are celebrating Christmas in the context of war. And so rather than a political statement, sort of would be the implication here, this was more a pastoral statement on behalf of the Pope. They noted that this was a gift from the city of Bethlehem to Pope Francis. Pope Francis, in the Vatican, by the way, did not put this delegation from the Palestinian embassy on the Pope's official calendar, nor did they release any transcript of his remarks. So we are relying here on what the Palestinian embassy had to say. But they said that, gazing upon this image of the baby Jesus in the crib with the keffiyeh, the Pope said that he was moved, thinking about, martyred Palestine and all those other children around the world suffering. And that he thanked all those present for the nativity set and asked that his regards be sent to the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. The Pope recalled that Abbas has been a frequent visitor in the Vatican over the years. Now, no surprise that to many Israelis and Jewish leaders around the world, this did not play particularly well. Many of them have been grumbling. Relatively few have said anything publicly, but privately, many of them have been grumbling. This is another example of the Vatican showing its true colors. That is, showing that it is not even-handed on the Israeli-Palestinian problem, but rather that they are fundamentally pro-Palestinian. I mean, one Jewish leader I heard from over the weekend said, "Where is the nativity set showing one of the Israeli hostages or one or more of the Israeli hostages behind bars? Where is the tribute to their suffering? on this occasion of one of the holiest days on the Christian calendar. In other words, the complaint, I don't think anybody begrudges the Pope's sympathy with innocent Palestinian victims of violence in the Gaza Strip or anywhere else. But I think the question is, where is the equal and opposite demonstrations, manifestation of concern for not only the Israeli hostages, but, all those Israelis who also have suffered, victims of bombings in the north and in the south of Israel, casualties of war, Israeli civilians who have been swept up in the violence. In other words, their complaint would be that it seems that for Pope Francis, Palestinian suffering often counts for more than does Israeli suffering. And so, the question is, where is the balance? And once it should say, this has been a long-standing complaint from Israeli leaders and Jewish leaders over the years, not just about Pope Francis, but really about every pope since the foundation of the modern state of Israel. There has been a concern that despite all the forward movement in Jewish Catholic dialogue since the Second Vatican Council, despite Nostra Aetate and all of that politically, the Vatican continues to see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a set of blinders that highlights what they perceive to be Israeli failures, Israeli injustices, but doesn't allow the Vatican to see the same kinds of problems on the Palestinian side. That's obviously not a complaint we are going to adjudicate here, but it is simply a reminder that even at Christmas time, the kind of delicate political calculations that all popes have to make, the hard political choices that all popes have to make. Do I allow this nativity set to be displayed in the audience hall to take a bold prophetic stand, or do I not? Because I don't want to blow up a diplomatic relationship and I don't want to appear to have taken sides. These, ladies and gentlemen, are incredibly difficult choices, and unfortunately, there's no Christmas holiday. There's no Easter holiday when it comes to these things. Popes face them 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We will obviously continue to follow the controversy about this particular choice as it unfolds. You will find full coverage of this and all the stories we've discussed on this episode on the Crux site. That is www.cruxnow.com. Again, www.cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. All right, I'll be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, I hope you have a healthy and happy, safe and joyous 7 days until we speak again. Be well, and I will talk to you again very soon.